Welcome to Reliability Matters, a podcast for the electronic assembly industry. Each episode covers topics related to reliability, best practices, and environmentally responsible assembly techniques, with insights from experts across the electronic assembly industry. Now, here's your host, Mike Conrad.
Welcome to the Reliability Matters podcast. I'm so glad you're with me today. Like most manufacturers, the electronic manufacturing industry relies on countless suppliers to fulfill its manufacturing needs. I'm quite certain there is no one within the EMS space who fabricates their own boards using materials produced in-house, operates their own semiconductor foundries, designs and manufactures their own components, and produces soldering materials for their reflow process. Our industry relies on a vast network of manufacturers throughout the world to build even the simplest electronic assembly. Intellectual property security, cybersecurity, national security are all hot topics today. No one wants their hard-earned intellectual property stolen. This is most true, perhaps, within the U.S. military establishment. There are, at present, numerous policies, procedures, and regulations designed to protect various parts of our supply chain from, shall we say, unscrupulous people and companies. Today, companies are concerned about controlled unclassified information, or CUI, and controlled technical information, CTI. And that brings us to IPC 1791. What is IPC 1791, you ask? Well, my guest today, IPC's Randy Cherry, will explain. Randy is Director of Validation Services at IPC. Validation Services is a series of certification programs that qualify products and processes to the IPC industry standards. Once companies have completed their certification, they are listed as an IPC trusted supplier on the IPC Validation Services website. Randy has over 30 years' experience in engineering with printed circuit board and backplane fabs, high-speed press-fit backplane connectors, and surface mount technology assembly practices. He is a certified SMT process engineer and an IPC auditor, and he is my guest today on this episode. Well, hey, Randy, thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Mike.
Well, good morning to you. I'm in California. Are you in Illinois? Is that where I'm catching you today?
Yes, I'm in Illinois, in the western suburbs of Chicago, about 50 miles west of O'Hare Airport.
Okay. Well, so far enough away you don't hear the planes roaring in.
Hopefully not.
But close enough that you can catch a flight. That's convenient. Not too close, not too far. Well, thanks again for joining me today. What brought you to IPC?
Well, as you had mentioned earlier, I had a long career in manufacturing. I've been working in manufacturing probably since the 80s now, I guess, and I spent the last 21 years at a company called Tell Labs in Naperville, Illinois. And Tell Labs was also an IPC member. And I was looking for something different, a new challenge, and I found out that IPC was looking for someone to start up this new department then it was called the Validation Business Unit, which was later renamed to Validation Services. So I had an opportunity to start to work at IPC, and we started basically with just the IPC standards, and we built the department from the ground up.
Excellent. We're going to talk about IPC 1791 and the validation services kind of in general. And just to put things into a framework, about 6 years ago, IPC and the executive agent for printed circuit boards and interconnect technology, that's a word, worked together to form an IPC committee. First, I know who IPC is. I think everyone in my audience knows who IPC is, at least everyone in my audience connected to the EMS world. Who or what is the executive agent for printed circuit boards and interconnect technology? I've been in this industry for 37 years, and I don't know if I should be embarrassed to admit this, but I've never heard of that very long-named industry or agency. Who are they? What are they?
Well, the executive agent obviously is a department that we partnered with here to help develop this program, and several people from the executive agent serve on the 2-19B IPC committee that helped create and develop the IPC 1791 standard. But the executive agent team that we work with is based in Crane, Indiana. They're at the naval base. And basically, the executive agent, it's driven by a Department of Defense directive. And you ready for this? It's 5101.18E as in Edward. That's the DoD directive that basically drives the executive agent.
Hi,
And
here's my
basically,
business card.
yeah, yeah, here you go. That's great.
It's got to be a business card the size of a legal document.
Our tax dollars hard at work.
I can only imagine what their email address is.
But basically, the executive agent acts as a facilitating body, providing access to, the definition is reliable trust and affordable printed circuit board fabrication and with assembly to products and interconnect technology. Basically, they're facilitating, helping the DoD out, letting them know what's going on in the industry, I guess is the best way to summarize it.
Yeah. So is the executive agent a government entity, or are they an entity that serves the DoD?
They're a government entity, yes,
Okay.
that serves the
All right.
DoD. That's the best way to capture it.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Thanks for explaining that mystery to me.
I gave it a try.
No, you did a good job. Now I feel a little bit more educated. That's one thing I love about hosting the show is I get to ask questions for things that I don't know about. So it's great. Tell me more about IPC's validation services. What is a validation service? Why does it exist in the first place, and who does it serve?
That's a great question, Mike. I started with IPC around 2013. As I mentioned earlier, validation services hadn't quite been created yet. So I had the opportunity to work with several good IPC folks to develop this program. But basically, it was driven by the OEMs, the IPC members, felt that they would like to see a program that validates that their suppliers are following the IPC standards, that their products and processes were meeting the IPC standards. So, with that in mind, we have three basic programs that validation services covers. The first one is built around two acronyms that have been around a long time. These are our audit qualification programs, the QPL, which is the Qualified Products List, and the QML, which is the Qualified Manufacturers List. Now, QPL and QML have been around a long time. A lot of people have used those acronyms. So at Validation Services, we just kind of just copied those and basically took the IPC standards and started developing audit programs around the IPC standards, focusing on the shall statements. And Mike, if you're familiar with our standards, shall statements, make up all of the requirements that are in the standards. And we started with the major standards, our top sellers, and we developed a program around the J Standard 001 and the IPC-A-610. As you know, those are our soldering standards. J Standard 001 has your requirements, and IPC 610 has the acceptability criteria. So we developed, that was one of our early programs that we developed prior to the 1791. So we have a few programs in that bucket. And then we started, when we got out and started meeting with members and non-members of IPC, we found that there were some companies that just weren't familiar with IPC or the IPC standards, similar to what you said earlier about the executive agent. So we created another program called IPC Standards Gap Analysis. And some people view that as a prerequisite to an audit, like for the QPL, QML program. But it's more of we'll send in folks from the IPC team to take a look at the company's processes and see how they stack up to the standards. Like I said, like a gap analysis. And we'll write a report with findings and recommendations. And we feel that kind of helps companies out, get them more comfortable working with IPC and get them more comfortable with the IPC standards. The third program is called Technology Solutions. And that's more of a troubleshooting, problem-solving program where the IPC team will come in and work on a specific problem. Like, for example, cleaning, something you know something about. And, maybe we'll focus on why the boards aren't getting as clean as they should be. And we'll work with the customer to help them solve their problem. So those are our three main programs that we offered validation services. I believe that answers the question.
Absolutely. So, in doing my research for this conversation, I'm reading quite a bit about the quote unquote 4 pillars of trust. And a lot of the questions I'm going to ask you about the validation services in 1791 and specifically will be about the 4 pillars of trust. So, first, let's, for my audience sake, let's identify what the 4 pillars of trust are.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Yeah, basically, those are the building blocks that the IPC committee came up with. Once again, this is the 2-19B committee, came up with to help develop the 1791 standard. And the first one is quality, and the second one was supply chain risk management, then security, and the last one was chain of custody.
Yeah, excellent. So let's dive into each one of those separately. So let's break it down. Let's break down these 4
All right.
pillars of trust, beginning with quality. How does the IPC validation service help to monitor or control or qualify, if you will, quality?
Okay. Well, basically, once again, we developed this 1791 standard and the QML program working with the executive agent and the 2-19B committee. So, starting with quality, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to look at what QMS or qualified management systems companies had. And one requirement that everyone agreed on is that you had to have your AS 9100. I forgot to mention that the 1791 is a DoD focused document. So we're focused on that military aerospace sector. And companies who participate in that sector typically have their AS 9100 already. So if they had that, that was one of the first steps in the process to meet the quality.
And let's just review AS 9100 is?
Well, AS 9100 started, basically companies would start with their ISO 9001. I think most people have heard of that.
Yep.
And that kind of covers pretty much anyone in the industry. But AS 9100 steps it up. It's kind of a requirement for the mil aerospace industry. And it takes a deeper dive into the quality, metrics that that companies have to go through. It's a very long, extensive process that a company has to go through to get that level of certification. Companies have to work very hard for that. Also, I want to mention that we also look at other things as part of the quality. Like if you're a printed circuit board fabrication shop, we'll look to see if you've been certified to the mill specs, like the 31032 or the 55110. We'll take a look at that. We also look at if you're a NADCAP accredited. So there's other things that we look at too, but it all starts off with the AS 9100. That's an absolute requirement that's in the standard that companies have to meet.
So if I'm an assembler and I'm putting together boards for the Navy or the Army or whatever, part of the certification program will be to look at my vendors, for example, my board fabricator, to make sure that they have the appropriate qualifications. Is that you're following the breadcrumbs through the supply chain, basically, to make sure
Correct.
that every member of the supply chain, where it is appropriate, has the correct certification. Am I right?
Right, and that's a great lead into the second
Exactly.
pillar here: supply chain risk management.
The word supply chain right now is just
Right.
as soon as you said supply
Exactly.
chain, I'm sure half my audience just stuck their head up. It's like,
Yeah.
because that's in the news these days for completely different reasons.
That's true.
Supply chain is almost an oxymoron because that implies there is a supply, right? But
Somewhere. Yeah.
somewhere there's a supply. Yeah. So let's talk about how supply chain and 1791 dance together.
Well, basically, what the committee did, again, with supply chain risk management, they wanted to focus on the problem areas, making sure, for example, that you have dual sources of supply, that you're not single sourced or sole sourced on a particular item, especially with today's environment that can shut down a manufacturing facility or even a circuit board fabrication situation. So they definitely focus on that. Obviously, counterfeit detection is very important in this standard. Counterfeiting has been talked about for several years. I know it's a big issue with the printed circuit board assembly area, but once again, it can also happen with laminates too. We've seen that. So we spend a lot of time working with that. Obsolescence is another key point in the standard that we look at with the supply chain. Also, we focus on financial checks. We find that a lot of companies don't do a deep dive on financial checks on their suppliers. And as I mentioned before, that kind of goes along with the dual sourcing too. If something happens, you have I don't know, like a tsunami somewhere, and something happens and the supplier goes down. Where can you get your supply to keep your manufacturing going? So that's a lot of the focus with the supply chain.
Right now, I know you're not in manufacturing now. You're in the press box looking down on manufacturing from that good 30,000 foot view. But since we've talked about supply chain, let me just kind of veer off the road a little bit into the shoulder. And what's your view on the supply chain situation right now? I'm hearing rumblings of a very slight improvement. I don't know if it's just because we're numb to it and we've been desensitized, or if it truly has signs of improvement. Are you, your ears are to the track, so to speak. Are you hearing any rumblings of it getting better, it's worse, it's the same?
Well, when I'm out in the field, if I'm happen to be out doing an audit or talking to customers, I hear different stories. But basically, I basically rely on our IPC team, our advocacy team out in Washington D.C. That's headed up by Chris Mitchell and his staff, and they're the ones that really have their ears to the ground on this. And they put out a weekly newsletter and email that comes out, and I read that every Friday, and that keeps me up to date with what's going on. But yeah, right now it's kind of a moving target, and I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think it's still going to take some time before things, if you want to use the term, what is normal anymore, before things will get back to maybe how they were just a little bit in the past. But I always encourage everyone to check with our advocacy team out in Washington to get the latest and greatest on that.
Yeah, I think there's two terms that can define 2020, 21, 22. One of them is "you're on mute." That seems to be a very common phrase, and the other one is "new normal." Right. So the new normal is "you're on mute." Right. That seems to be. If I can never hear those terms again, I'd be very happy.
I agree.
The third pillar of trust is security. Now that, particularly today, is a hot button topic. Seems like every few weeks I'm getting notifications from Apple to, quickly do a security update on my phone, right, because they found vulnerabilities. Anytime I enter my password into a website, I'm given a warning that that password has been compromised some other site, and I should change it immediately. I mean, and these are just consumer versions of security. I can only imagine what goes on in the military world. The word security is, obviously highly contextual. And when you talk about security within the context of validation services, what do you mean by that? And what does the validation service provide in relation to security?
Well, when we were working on the committee and we got to the security section, once again, as I mentioned in the quality section, we kind of wanted to build off of what was already out in the industry. And the NIST SP 800-171, which covers cybersecurity reporting and other things that go along with that, it's kind of an IT-driven type program. We wanted to build off of that and those 110, I guess they're called practices, they're requirements, and there's 14 domains or families that make up the NIST SP 800-171. So we wanted to start with that. And basically, to meet the IPC 17.1 standard, you have to demonstrate compliance to the NIST. You got some more acronyms I'm going to throw at you. You have to show us your SSP, which is your system security plan, and then you also have to show us your POAM, which is your plan of actions and milestones. And these are two very important documents that a customer needs to take care of if they're moving towards getting their NIST compliance. And we'll talk more about NIST later when we talk a little bit about CMMC. There's some interesting contrast there. But we started the security with that. But then we took it further than that. We wanted to make sure that companies had their ITAR and their EAR registrations. Now, there's more acronyms, the International Traffic and Arms Regulation and the Export Administration Regulation, controlling what you export, and then of course ITAR. That acronym's used all over the military and aerospace industries. Also, it's in the standard. They talk about perimeter, the building, making sure the building is secure. There's certain questions we'll ask the receptionist to make sure that they know when they're letting people into the building if it's secured. Citizenship is something that's checked quite often.
Which kind of goes to ITAR right there, right?
Correct. That kind of goes along with ITAR. The standard talks about non-disclosures or NDAs. There's another acronym. Also, background checks on employees, including criminal background checks, are also a requirement of the standard. And all this falls under the security bucket. And one more important thing you just indicated earlier with your cell phone is portable electronic devices that can do recording, take photography. Once again, that gets back under ITAR again. But basically, we want to make sure that everything is secure. And you and I aren't walking into an ITAR facility and we decide to start taking pictures of something that we shouldn't be taking pictures of. And that falls under the CUI, CTI buckets that you had mentioned earlier. So the security in 1791 I think it's pretty extensive.
I was walking through several years ago, visiting a customer, and the customer was a manufacturer of drones that they sell to the military. And as we're walking through the building, there was a room with windows around it, and in this room was a drone helicopter. I would say about maybe third scale of the size of a actual human piloted helicopter. And I'm a pilot, I'm an aviation enthusiast, so I looked at that and I asked my escort, is there any way I can go in and look at that? And he says, oh, absolutely, I just have to get clearance. So all of a sudden, two guys in security uniforms come down and grill me over what are the reasons I want to see it. And it's like, because I think it's cool. I don't know if that's a checkbox, right? I said, look, if I don't need to see it, I don't want to cause problems, but I just find that as like the ultimate toy, the ultimate game. And so they let me in. They were cool, but it was funny. Just asking to see something that was obviously there and on display triggered a series of protocols, probably part of their procedures,
Sure.
Some of the procedures you audit. The other funny anecdote was many, many years ago, probably in the late 80s. I got into this industry in 1985, so this was probably 87, 88. I was over at a Hughes Aircraft building in L.A., next to the airport, El Segundo. And I did not have a security clearance, and I was in an area in their assembly area that was building boards that required some kind of security clearance to view. And here was their security protocol. They had these tech benches, and they had this metal frame, like a shower curtain rail, not like a shower curtain rail, a shower curtain rail that surrounded the tech bench. And I had an escort who would walk about 15 feet in front of me and announce. There was some acronym. It was basically, a non-classified, non-cleared person is approaching. And each technician would just turn around and pull the shower curtain. They were powder blue shower curtains. I remember that. And you'd hear, the metal hoops pull along the shower rail, the shower curtain rail, and close off visibility to whatever they were hand soldering at the time or whatever they were doing. And that was their security protocol. shower curtains. Now I can only imagine those
Interesting.
shower curtains were probably $10,000 shower curtains because they probably had a mill standard attached to it. But but I just thought our national security is being protected by otherwise $3 plastic shower curtains. And I would
I can honestly say I haven't run into that scenario, so that's pretty good that you shared
yeah,
that.
this was, and I was young. I was in my 20s, and I'm just thinking, is this is it? I thought it was James Bond and high tech and all this stuff, and it came down, at least in that case, to shower curtains. Anyway,
Well, I can tell you the companies that the validation services teams have visited, we haven't run into shower curtains. Usually it's locked doors that require a badge access doors to get in. And you are correct, though. Whenever one of the validation service auditors goes to one of these facilities to do an audit, they're always escorted. That's always the
yeah,
case.
yeah,
And you're escorted everywhere, except maybe in the reception area, of course. But other than that, yeah, you're not left alone at all.
yeah.
But another thing you said, Mike, that's interesting, we're both engineers and we both like to tinker around and play with things. So I get excited too when I'm at a Mill Aerospace company and I get to see some military equipment, get up close. That's one of the exciting things about this job is you get to visit so many different companies. You see so many different things. Like you said, you can't take any pictures of them or show anybody what you saw, but
Yeah,
it's still pretty
there's no
interesting.
bragging, there's no provable bragging rights. You can't come show your
No.
grandkids pictures of the next generation cruise missile. But uh, yeah, it is. Our industry is fascinating. We
It
are
is.
we're an industry that builds everything that is around us.
Hmm.
So you can be anywhere in the world, and you're within just a few feet of something we build as an
Hmm.
industry, right?
And that's IPC's theme: build electronics better. So
Yeah.
you hit the nail right on the head with that one.
There we go. There we go. Okay, the fourth pillar of trust is chain of custody. Now,
Hmm.
for us civilians, or for the civilians listening or watching this show that aren't in the EMS industry, they think of chain of custody kind of in a legal sense. If you've watched Law and Order or some legal drama, maybe Perry Mason back in the day, you may have heard the term chain of custody. But chain of custody applies in a number of contexts, including the one we're talking about. So explain what
Hmm.
chain of custody is, and if you can provide some examples of why chain of custody is so important and how controlling a chain of custody would be part of a validation service.
Sure. When the committee worked on chain of custody, like you said, there are several definitions to it. The committee wanted to focus on control of documents, data, records, things like that. Some examples would be like traceability records, and that's a pretty broad term, but let's talk about printed circuit board design. You have your CAD files, which are the Gerber files, or if you're using the new IPC 2581, the XML files, those are very critical to the design of a circuit board. And of course, you have your schematics, and in manufacturing, you have your work instructions, your drawings, the drawings that show you how to put the product together. All of that, it has to be handled as part of your CUI, CTI. So all that has to be traceable, trackable, and you have to have a method of storing, and you have to have a retention method for how long you keep these records. Most companies, because it's electronics and server space is cheap, they keep it forever, but it has to be secure. So the customer has to demonstrate that all of this information I just described is secured, and people like you and I can't access it from our home laptops or off of our phones. Um, Also, with chain of custody, what's also important is identification and serialization of the circuit boards, for example, as they move through the manufacturing process. Another one is that people forget about is scrap material, and also the destruction of scrap and how's that handled. The validation team have been some places where they'll take like a scrap circuit board and just toss it in a bin and then reclaim the precious metals. Well, that's not good enough. Someone can take that circuit board and reverse engineer it. So you have to destroy it. You have to grind it up. You have to do something to it so someone cannot reverse engineer it. And the standard goes in quite a bit of detail talking about that. Another one that's overlooked is shipping. Most of the time you just put boards in a box, wrap them up. We're going to ship them to the Mike Conrad house, 10 pieces, and out the door they go. But Mike, when you get the boards, you open up the box, there may only be 9 in there. And you're scratching your head, where did that 10th one go? Well, that's a problem that the standard addresses, and they're wanting companies to do a closed loop shipping process where they're tracking that shipment from when it leaves to when you get it, to make sure that if we are shipping 10 boards to the Mike Conrad company, you actually get 10 circuit boards. And a lot of companies now are making it more difficult for people to get into shipping containers and tamper with that. And then also training's a big one with chain of custody. Like I said, a lot of companies, they're not quite sure what it means. So we really focus training a lot, not only in chain of custody, but I forgot to mention in security too. There's also a training requirement regarding insider threat training. So employees who are not familiar with the terms CUI and CTI, they get the proper training so they can understand, so they know what the differences are between what should be classified as CUI and what should not.
Yeah, very good. So back in August of 2018, the IPC 1791 Trusted Electronic Designer Manufacturer and Assembler Requirements Standard.
Long
Yeah. Y'all aren't known for concise, short phrases. Our industry isn't. That requirement was released, or that the requirement standard was released.
Yes.
Tell me more about what all that is about. Tell me more about that standard.
Well, sure. Once again, as we said, we covered the 4 pillars earlier, but the standard focuses on printed circuit board design, fabrication, and assembly. And recently we added cable and wire harness assembly to the standard. So there's actually 4 separate audit qualification programs comes from that standard. And then there's a 5th one that we just recently added to for non-US locations. For example, when you look at the QML for 1791 that I'll talk more about here in a minute, we did audit one company up in Toronto, Canada, and that was a circuit board fabrication shop. And we had to get approval to do that. We had to get a sponsorship letter from one of the primes, one of the OEM primes, to say, hey, we support IPC validation services working with the executive agent to go up and audit this facility. So we have a lot of checkpoints in the process to do that. But basically, the standard, it's, as I said earlier, it's a DoD focused standard. Once again, it's for companies who provide products and services to the DoD. So once again, but we focus in those 4 areas, as I said earlier: design, fabrication, and assembly, and then of course cable and wire harnesses. And that's really what that with the 4 pillars pretty much covers the standard.
Yeah, excellent. You dropped an acronym, surprise, surprise, a few moments ago, QML, which is Qualified Manufacturers List. Let's talk about that. In late 2019, IPC released the IPC 1791 QML, Qualified Manufacturers Manufacturers List program. Tell me more about what the 1791 QML is all about.
Well, once again, getting back to our work with the committee and the executive agent, while the committees were developing the standard, the 1791 standard, the executive agent was out doing what I'll call beta site audits, kind of testing the waters a little bit and getting feedback that they could use to help make the standard better and also get more committee members. And then IPC then got involved, and because we have the marketing arm, the sales arm, we actually took over the program from the executive agent and started doing the audits at that time. And as I mentioned, we're starting to do these audits now, doing them for the last 3 years. It's a 3-year qualification. Basically, we have an audit process that we go through. Currently, we have 34 company locations currently on the 1791 QML, and it's a site base. So we have one company that has, I believe, 10 locations on it now, and others that we've been working with, and the list continues to grow. We've got the team has several audits to do here just in the next few months. So it's been a very, very popular program, and it's growing quite a bit.
So all IPC standards are developed by us, by you, by me, by stakeholders. Maybe not
Correct.
Literally you, because you're not in the manufacturing side anymore. But but you're part of the process, and we regulate ourselves, and then we have committees, and then we vote, and it's a long, painstaking, sometimes painful yet beneficial process to create these standards. I would imagine 1791 is no exception to that. So, what types of companies drove the details of 1791?
Well, as you can imagine, it was your high reliability companies, your military aerospace OEMs, and some suppliers. Also, circuit board shops who are very heavily invested in the mil aerospace area join the committee. I can't remember exactly, but I believe we've got over 40 active members on the committee, and it's a pretty cross-functional group where we have representatives from each parts of the industry, OEM, suppliers, things like that. So we get a lot of good feedback. We also get feedback from the customers when the validation service team's out doing audits. During the course of the audit, the customer will say, hey, how come the standard doesn't talk about this? Or maybe this section should be reworded a little differently. And then the auditors will bring that back to validation services. And then I'm on the committee, so I'll take that back to the committee then and share with what we've learned with people out in the field. Because as you know, Mike, not everybody who sits on the committees, that's only a small percentage of the overall industry. And a lot of companies who operate on tight budgets can't afford to go to our trade shows or participate on the committees. But yet again, we give them the opportunity to share their thoughts, views, and ideas. And as I said, validation services will bring that back to the committee, and that helps improve the standard.
Yeah, absolutely. While the genesis of these standards seems to be rooted in military OEMs and contractors, there seems to be that there could be a lot of valuable takeaways to the rest of us, to the commercial industry. So how can this standard benefit commercial OEMs, even if they're not actually part of the validation service? There's got to be some nuggets of takeaway, because those 4 pillars of trust and security and chain of custody and quality, they apply to everybody. They apply to someone making an electronic flea collar, as much as a satellite. So, how is there any value in someone that's not really tied to military, that's not under a requirement to get certified? Is there an option for commercial companies to embrace this standard, either formally or informally?
That's a great question. And you were correct. There's a lot of people in the industry who wanted something more. The automotive industry, medical, telecom, and the industrial industry all have needs and concerns about cybersecurity. So basically, there's another committee, the 2-12C, that was formed, I believe, a little over a year ago. I'm not sure on that. And they're currently working on developing a new standard called the 1792. Now, here's another long title, and I'm going to read it to you so I don't mess it up. 1792 is the standard for cybersecurity management in the manufacturing and industry supply chain. Okay, another long title. But once again, this committee's been working pretty hard on it. Some committee members from the 2-19B committee that worked on 1791 moved over to this new committee, the 2-12C, to help develop 1792. This has more of a supply chain, I'll call it a general industry focus, kind of getting back to what you're saying. It is not tied to the DoD per se, but it focuses a lot more, not just on circuit boards, but also on the components and also on the final products and the process to assemble those final products. Now, currently this standard is in development. I'm not 100% sure where it's at in the process. I know they've got a draft done, and I believe it's in review right now, but I don't have a date yet as to when that standard is going to be released. But once again, IPC is pretty good about putting out emails, letting the industry know when new standards come out. But to answer your question, there has been quite a bit of development working on the 1792, and I'm not saying that's going to totally answer your question, but it's a start in the right direction.
Yeah, because the same things the military is concerned about, I'm concerned about. Although, failure can be defined differently. If someone steals my design, the world is not going to end tomorrow. We're not going to be invaded,
Right.
by
Right.
Russian troops or something. But there's still a cost associated with that, right?
Absolutely.
Industrial espionage and counterfeit apply to everybody because there's a financial risk involved, if not a security risk. So we're kind of playing in a time machine here. We keep going back and forth to different times. But back in August of 2018, the IPC 1791 Trusted Electronic Designer, Manufacturer, and Assembler Requirements standard was released. It's currently on revision B, with revision C in the works. That tells me there was an A, then there was a B, and now C is in the works. Was revision B and the upcoming revision C a reflection of changing threats or changing technologies or all of the above, including other factors? What is the reason for the various revisions in a relatively short period of time?
Well, once again, the landscape, as you know, has been pretty dynamic with all the changes going on in the industry today that we touched on at the beginning of this podcast. But basically, the Rev B standard I feel is in pretty good shape. But the committee's working on Rev C, really once again just to clean up a few things, make some of the sections a little easier to read, a little easier to understand. As I said earlier, there's a lot of acronyms that we covered earlier, and we just want to make sure that the industry understands what they're reading when they read the standard. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the validation services team, we've been out doing some audits. We've done over 40 audits since we took this over from the executive agent. And we're getting a lot of feedback from the members, the customers, the users of this standard. And as I said earlier, not all these companies can send people to Apex or to Summercom to sit in these committee meetings. So the validation services team brings that feedback back to the committee. And like I said, we're just kind of it's not from Rev B to Rev C. It's not a major overhaul. We're just kind of just tweaking a few sections, as I said, kind of cleaning up the verbiage a little bit and just making the standard a little easier to read, a little easier to use. And that's really what this is. We hope to get Rev C out by the end of this year, hopefully by December. I hope get it out before Apex.
There you go. So how does 1791 compare or contrast with Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC? Since we're floating acronyms, we'll just throw a few more on the table.
Sure. Yeah, the Cybersecurity Maturity Matrix Certification. Yeah, that's another long one. But one thing that I've done at IPC is I like to study the competition. And the CMMC has been through a lot of iterations over the last few years. Last year they came out with CMMC 2.0, and they went from 5 different levels of accreditation down to 3. And level 2, I believe, will be the one that most people will want to go for once CMMC is finally released. And last I heard, I think they're targeting May or June of next year before CMMC will actually get started. But who knows? The government's working on it, and there's always a lot of tweaks and changes. But when you look at CMMC 2.0 level 2, one of the things that's the same is both CMMC and 1791 require the NIST SP 800-171. So if you plan to go for your CMMC level 2, you got to demonstrate that you meet those 110 practices or requirements that are in the NIST SP 800-171. Therefore, you have to have your SSP and your POAM that I talked about earlier. And those have to be up to date, and you'll have to present all that to the C3PAO, the certified auditors that the CMMC is going to have to go out and do these assessments. So there's going to be quite a few steps that you have to go through to obtain the CMMC certification. But that's where 1791 and CMMC are the same. Other than that, as I mentioned earlier, 1791 goes off in these other areas with quality, supply chain, chain of custody that CMMC doesn't really touch on, especially for level 2. And then level 1, to meet the level 1 requirements of CMMC, that's a much, easier task. I think there's only 17 requirements you have to meet for that one. So it's a little simpler. Right. But still, it's very fluid right now with CMMC, and I recommend everyone to go to their website and keep up with all the changes that are going on with it.
Right. It sounds like the 1791 is more expansive and more comprehensive with its qualified manufacturing list and qualified manufacturers list and other aspects of it. It seems to be, for lack of a better description, a larger umbrella.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, it's available now. I mean, if companies want to see where they're at with their cybersecurity protection, 1791 is ready to go. You can purchase the Rev B standard, read it, and see how you stack up against it. Do your own internal gap analysis and see how it stacks up. And then, like I said, IPC Validation Services is here to serve the industry and help companies out that have more questions in that area.
Global issues like
Mm-hmm.
the pandemic and supply chain shortages have caused many manufacturers to at least reconsider reshoring or maybe nearshoring their manufacturing. I live in California, and within the first few days following an earthquake, there is a dramatic rush of people calling their insurance agents trying to get insurance, right? Or
Right.
when there's a wildfire, everyone's calling their insurance company to see what their fire insurance is at. And then if there's a large earthquake, we may go to the store and stock up on water and batteries and whatever. But then after 3 or 4 days, we forget all that, right? And we what we learn from the past is that we don't learn from the past, right? It's that type of thing. So the reason for saying that is we tend to respond when the criticality is high, and then as life goes back to normal, we tend to forget about that stuff until we have another emergency again. The pandemic and the supply chain issues have kind of brought a lot of this awareness to the shortfalls and pitfalls in our system, to bear. Have you seen an extra request for things like 1791? Have you seen 1791 spike a little bit? Have you sold more more standards in light of recent events, in light of people working from home and homes maybe being less secure, in light of supply chain shortages, in light of the fact that container ships are floating in the ocean for weeks and weeks and weeks before they're unloaded, and
Right.
in light of all the security concerns that we're seeing today, is that driving a greater acceptance and desire for something like 1791?
That's a great question. Building awareness, I believe, is what IPC does very well through our marketing. And basically, IPC has been building awareness about cybersecurity and the cybersecurity work that IPC is doing. We talk about 1791, 1792, and I believe there's going to be more cybersecurity standards developed here in the future. And I think cybersecurity is a concern for all companies, as I mentioned earlier, not just the aerospace sector, but for all the industries, as I mentioned earlier, automotive, medical, telecom. I think they're all concerned about it. And I think as we develop these new standards, I think what's going to be critical is we get the volunteers, we get the industry experts, the subject matter experts that know a lot more about cybersecurity than you and I, Mike. And we need those people in our committees to make sure we're going in the right direction with these standards. Because, if we don't do our best and these standards don't, meet the needs of the industry, people aren't going to use them. Now, I think we've done a great job on 1791, and I've kind of looked at 1792, and as I said earlier, I think that's going in the right direction too. But I think that's just the beginning, and I think as time moves on, I think you're going to see more push to get more documentation out in this area of cybersecurity.
When do you accept? I won't hold you to this, but when do you expect 1792 to be ready for prime time?
Once again, I don't have any dates for me on that. I'll have to pass on that question.
That's probably a wise answer, right?
Yeah. Well, once
Because otherwise,
again,
Randy said.
Right. Well, once again, you send a document out for comments, and then if you get some comments or some no votes, then you have to go back to the committee and address those, and that can stretch it out. But I do know the 1792, it's getting close. And if I get some information on it, I'll put that out in a future email or something like that.
There we go. All right. Fair enough. And finally, if someone in my audience is interested in finding out more about IPC 1791 or becoming a trusted supplier, what's the next step for them?
Well, the easiest step is just to contact me directly. My email address is real easy. It's just my full name, Randy Cherry, one word, at ipc.org.
And for my audience, if you look down in the show notes, if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, look at the show notes, and I'll have Randy's contact information there, as well as a link to 1791 in the standards section of the IPC store. And if you're watching this on YouTube, just look down and it says "Show More." Click that, and you'll see the same. So we'll try very hard to connect you with Randy and the resources that we're talking about today. Once someone embraces the standard, once someone purchases a standard, is there a typical length of time? I know it's probably dependent upon the cooperation of the company and the availability of their team to supply information. But is there an average amount of time before they can be certified, before they can go on a QML, for example?
That's a great question. There's no right or wrong answer to this. We've seen some companies take up to a year just to get ready for an on-site audit. The big one, as I mentioned earlier, is that NIST SP 800-171 and those 110 practices. And then having your AS9100. Those are two of the big hurdles you have to cross first. And if you haven't gotten to those points yet, the validation services team will give you some tips and ideas on how to get you along through the process. Some companies who have already been through that and are ready to go, things can happen in just a few months. So it just depends on how far a particular company is along with their cybersecurity process. We work with the IT departments quite a bit, along with quality, human resources. There's a lot of different departments that are involved when you go through this standard.
Yeah. Do most people who make a decision to embrace 1791, do most of them already have some of those other standards in place, or is it normal for someone to come with nothing in place and have to rebuild everything, or build everything, I should say?
We've come across a couple of companies like that, but most of the companies are familiar with AS9100 and the NIST, and most of the companies are aware of CMMC. That's been talked about for a few years now. So a lot of companies have been moving forward and doing the right things to prep and get ready for it. But once again, they like to have what you call like a third set of eyes to come in and just to make sure that, to coin an expression, the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed. They just want to make sure that they're doing the right things. And the validation service team can help them and guide them down that path.
Wonderful. Well, Randy Cherry, Head of Validation Services at IPC, thank you so much for being my guest today on the show. And thanks for explaining more details about that program. I really appreciate it. And for my audience, again, if you'd like to contact Randy, get more information on 1791 or validation services, look at the show notes and you'll be able to contact Randy. So Randy, thank you once again for being my guest today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I've enjoyed this too. This being my first experience here with Reliability Matters, I've really enjoyed this. This was great.
Good. Not too painful. Hopefully.
No, not at all.
It wasn't painful for me. It wasn't painful for you. Hopefully my audience found it not too painful. And I think we accomplished at least that. So thanks for being my guest. Well, that's another episode. Thanks for listening to or watching the Reliability Matters podcast. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Reliability Matters on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and our newest channel, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. A special thank you to Circuit Assembly Magazine's PCB Chat at pcbchat.com and Ascendo Reliability at reliability.fm for syndicating the show. Thanks for your questions and episode suggestions. Please keep them coming. Send questions and comments and episode suggestions to Mike at MikeConrad.com. That's Conrad with a K. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, click the subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when new episodes are released. We release new episodes on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month. Once again, thanks for listening or watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy, and perhaps most importantly, keep doing it right. And I'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks for listening to the Reliability Matters podcast. Join us on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month for new episodes of Reliability Matters.